Everyone see that? Great.
Yes.
Well, hello everyone. I want to welcome you all to Stopping US and Canada's Participation in NATO Wars webinar. We're grateful for all of you who can join us online as well as in person in Brussels. My name's Ali MacDonald and I'm the National Coordinator for Canadian Voice of Women for Peace in Canada. And as you can see, I'll be co-hosting with the esteemed Anne Wright and advisory board member of Veterans for Peace. Anne's located in Brussels and currently for the Global Women for Peace United Against NATO's events, which she'll be giving us an update very shortly. Our incredible speakers today include Medea Benjamin, Tamara Lawrence, Shivangi Misra, and Joseph Gerson. And unfortunately, Rebecca Irby has fallen sick and she'll be unable to join us today, which we do recognize as a loss, as she has great insights to provide us. So I wanted to share with all of you that the Global Women for Peace United Against NATO have created a declaration for peace, and I urge everyone to read it and sign the declaration. It has been translated into various languages, and I'll just try and put the link here into the chat. There we go. And move to our agenda. So this is our agenda for today. First, I'll do a land acknowledgement. For those who might not know what a land acknowledgement is, they've become a common practice in Canada and the United States and elsewhere as a way to recognize the history of the location we live, work, and play on, and to honor past, present, and future contributions of Indigenous people. It is also a way to recognize the genocide that's taken place here and against the Indigenous people and the land that was stolen from them, and a call to action for us to make change for the present and future. So then we'll move on to Anne, and she'll provide us a report from all the happenings with the Global Women for Peace United Against NATO in Brussels. And afterwards, we're going to hear from all of our knowledgeable speakers. So each speaker will provide you insight on a different NATO-related topic for 10 minutes. And after hearing from all of our speakers, we're going to have a 30-minute question and answer period. So feel free to put your questions into the chat as you think of them during the webinar, and I can keep track of them and read them out during the question and period time. Or you're also welcome to just hold on to your questions and raise your hand during that time and ask the panel yourself. Lastly, we'll have some closing remarks, and I'll also be sharing a calls to action handout with all of you, which contains some of the calls to action shared by our panelists and any related resources connected to those calls to action. And yeah, so then we'll move on to the land acknowledgement. So it's important to learn about the Indigenous homelands that you're on. I'm going to put a link in the chat for you to find out whose Indigenous homelands you are on. So I live, work, and play on the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples, situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is the land granted to the Six Nations that included 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. So we believe that allyship is a continuous process. It's not a designation that one can earn and hold forever, or a label that one can give themselves. Allyship is earned through actions. And as beneficiaries of this land, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and understand its history and the current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and to be accountable to the oppression that they continue to face. So we need to commit in our actions and our community to hold ourselves accountable, and in the continuous work of decolonizing to ensure that we do not perpetuate the harms colonization has done and to begin to repair them. So we ask that each of you today considers donating even at least $1 to an Indigenous organization of your choice. I'm going to put a link in the chat that lists 15 charities for Indigenous peoples and communities in Canada. And I'll also include in the chat a list of 9 charities that operate across the US and assist various tribes, Indigenous communities, and people with Native American heritage. I recognize that some of you support different organizations that help Indigenous peoples and work with them. So please reach out to them today if you have a preferred organization, but we recognize that even $1 can help. And that is just a small step that we can do in beginning to be an ally and begin to repair. So now I'm going to pass things over to Anne to share her report from Brussels, Belgium, and that will be followed by introducing our first speaker.
I wonder, sorry to interrupt here, but I wonder if it could be recorded so that
It is.
I'm not sure if it's being recorded and live streamed so that it can be shared afterwards, because I see that there are, you know, people that aren't on. I know that they would like to
Thank you,
follow
Tara.
it.
Yes, it is being
afterwards.
recorded. It's not being live streamed, but it is on a webinar, but
You can hear the audience
Anyway,
here. We've got
25 people
mostly women, but a few strong guys here that
are
are
saying no to NATO, and we've had 2 days of saying no to NATO. Yesterday was a banner day. We all went home hooped because we started early in the morning with wonderful presentations from 10 of our women that are attending from all over, primarily Europe, but we do have one person from Australia. Yes.
We had a delegation that went to NATO headquarters, and they told us their story, and we told them our story. That no to NATO.
And it was a spirited discussion. Then during that time was one of the webinars, and that was the webinar on Europe. Then we ended up going out to Albertini Square in Brussels for a very good rally for no to NATO. Following coming back here to a remarkable facility, and we thank Verderdi and Leo and Ludo for arranging for us to come to this wonderful Piano Fabrique for a wonderful location, for food that has been just outstanding, for a concert as we left yesterday evening, and in a wonderful part of Brussels with a lot of people out on the streets. And today we've had webinars and webinars and webinars. We started out with a webinar in Asia and the Pacific. Then we followed it with a webinar of Latin America. And then we've just heard two very, very important presentations about Ukraine and Afghanistan. And so here in the late afternoon, we follow with the presentation about the Canada and the US and their roles in NATO, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think it's going to be the bad and the ugly. And pardon me, yes. And of course, the Africa Symposium, indeed, that was one of the ones that was going on while we were in NATO. So yes, we've had Europe, Africa, Asia, the Pacific, Latin America, and now we do the US and Canada. So Ali, go ahead and take it over. And we're so pleased that all of our guests, our speakers are here with us today. Thank you.
Excellent. So first we're going to start off with Joseph Gerson, President of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He'll be covering NATO's history and a plethora of details within that. So I'll end my share screen and allow you to share yours, Joseph.
To see where this is. Here we go. Okay, sounds like you've been doing a lot, and my hat is off to you for perseverance of people in Brussels after 2 days and this long day. And as soon as I can get out of this one piece here, I'm screen sharing. Yes, very good. Get to the slideshow, and we'll have to take it this way. Okay, so I wanted to begin with three contexts. Just to be clear that NATO's expansion, the contributing cause, but not the only cause of the war in Ukraine. It's the world's largest and most powerful military force, global, and in the contest to share the post-Cold War order, U.S. military first policies have the U.S. competing in the wrong arena. I'm going to be moving through a lot of slides quickly. This slideshow will go up on my organization's webpage, and happy to make it available to others. You have to understand the context of NATO. Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor to Carter, wrote a very important book after he was out of office, essentially describing how the U.S. imperial project, his words, worked, looking at the centrality of Eurasia to global power. And we said was the U.S. has to maintain toeholds on three sides of Eurasia. In the West, it's NATO. In the South, it was the Middle East, Afghanistan, now maybe India. And then on the eastern flank, which is being reinforced, but the U.S. has had an unsinkable aircraft carrier in Japan since 1945, and rather more. Its fundamental purposes. The first General Secretary of NATO, Lord Hastings, says the purpose is to keep the Soviet Union out, Americans in, and the Germans down. And this has been on steroids basically since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Little noted, to encourage the economic collaboration between any and all of NATO members, to look at the economic integration of Europe, and of course U.S. access and influence in the European economy. Post 9/11 has been to secure the global South. Lisbon Summit in 2010, and in the last couple of years, focus has expanded to a major concentration on containing China. It's interesting in terms of NATO at war. It was, while it had a nuclear dimension, a heavy nuclear dimension during the Cold War period, its actual wars have been fought since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And I think we need to understand the transformation here in NATO. This is a map, if you think a little bit in terms of Russian history, the invasions by Napoleon, the Kaiser, and Hitler. This map is something that chills strategic thinkers in Russia. Again, little.
Sure, sir. Would I be able to just ask you to put it in presentation mode? Some people just can't read because it's a bit smaller. Just down on the right-hand side, on the very bottom. Yep, into the next one right over. Thank you.
Okay. So little understood here is that in the 1990s, we did have a common security model for Europe. Three major documents: the Paris Charter, the NATO-Russia Counter Alliance, and the 1999 OSCE memorandum, all of which were very clear that no country would seek to improve its security at the expense of others, even as Clinton broke that. And very important was George Kennan, the author of the Cold War doctrine, basically saying that the expansion, look at the end here, was likely to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. Kind of a major turning point came in 2007, following the continuous expansion of NATO at the Munich military summit, the security summit. Putin had enough, and he said, we have a right to ask against whom this expansion is intended, and I think that marks his giving up on the idea of a common European home and moving to defend what he perceived to be Russia's interests. Forces driving NATO's expansion. In the West, we're looking at continuing Cold War ideologies, the expansion and integration with European economies, and the military-industrial complex, which have been making a lot of money in the Ukraine war. But we also do remember that people in Eastern Europe do have agency. And they had memories of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which divided Poland, Baltic states being annexed, and the Soviet Union's military interventions to put down democratic uprisings. So, they have some unhappy memories. This is a lot to consume quickly, but it's basically a history of NATO's expansion. What you'll see is that it was somewhat slow up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1982, Spain becomes the 16th member. We're now up to, what, 31 members? And, it's gone in if you will, gasps of expansion, since Bill Clinton began the expansion. And to appreciate that NATO is a global alliance. Here in the United States, we think of it still, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But as you'll see, it's got a number of partnership agreements. On this list, for the Euro-Atlantic Partnership, you'll see Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyz Republic. You had in 1994 the Mediterranean Dialogue, which expanded NATO's influence and significant control over North Africa and the Middle East, as well as Europe. The Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which consolidated or helped consolidate U.S. and Western control in the Persian Gulf. And now we have what's called Partners Across the Globe. And this has been deepening in recent years. I'll come back to this in a moment, but you look at the number of Asian countries here and the increased focus within NATO on containing China, managing its borders. The other piece that's here is, we have the recent membership now of Finland, and Sweden. Even if it's not formally accepted in the next few days, the process is underway to basically make it fully, lots of weapons and fully integrated with NATO, whether or not it's a formal membership. In track 2 discussions I've been involved in, the reference to the Baltic Sea now is as an American lake. It's an area where we have B-52s flying over. We've got Russian planes occasionally buzzing at 100 feet, U.S. warships. And I think our peace movement needs to begin to understand the tensions here in the Baltic Sea, which are certainly at this point almost as intense as they are in the Black Sea. And really, since 2021, you've had the NATO commitment to containing China. Pictured here are President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan. They've attended the last couple of NATO summits. NATO is now opening a center in the Japanese capital, likely at a U.S. military base. So here's a little bit more on that, and it's quite clear that the goal here is containing China. Over time, NATO's doctrines have changed. It was founded shortly after the Berlin crisis in 1948. Its initial focus was ostensibly and largely defensive. Not that Russia was Soviet Union was eager to invade. You had, with Eisenhower moving to massive retaliation. The Russians had far more conventional forces than the U.S. did, and so the goal here was to threaten really the elimination of all human life if the Soviets invaded. You had the changes, especially in post-Cold War period. The beginning of the fundamental change with the war, the Kosovo-Serbia war, fought in violation of the UN Charter. You had post 9/11, the increased focus on the global South, and now increasingly the containment both of Russia and China. NATO out of area operations were consolidated, new doctrine in 2010, and we saw its full implementation with the bombing and the overthrow of the government in Libya. To appreciate that NATO is a nuclear alliance, something not to be taken lightly. basically threatening the end of human civilization as we know it. And it's interesting with this doctrine here. Any change in this policy should be made by the alliance as a whole. It means that individual countries can't opt out of the nuclear sharing or their role in hosting nuclear weapons. That decision has to be approved by the whole of NATO, which is to say the U.S. has full control over that. In NATO's future, others will be talking about this, but it's really quite uncertain. Even if the West prevails in the Ukraine war, at that point, especially around China, you may find some fissures. But we're also likely to be facing, I hate to say it, what some describe as an ice age in Euro-Atlantic Russian relations. So that's quick and dirty. Some of the things that we might do is it's really important to do education because so few people really know about NATO and what it does. Work for ceasefire negotiations in Ukraine, Russian withdrawal. Work for renewed disarmament and strategic stability diplomacy. I mean, the situation is indeed quite dangerous. And a number of people are talking about the importance of convening OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Summit in 2025 to provide a forum where at least some discussions around restoring strategic stability, recreating a European security architecture, and greatly reducing the dangers of nuclear catastrophe could take place. So quick and dirty, but thank you for your attention.
For sharing your expansive knowledge on the history of NATO, its extensive expansion and discussion partners across the globe, as well as I wasn't aware that the Baltic Sea is now the American lake. So I appreciate you sharing all of your information, as well as your list of what individuals can do to advocate. So that information will also be included on the calls to action handout that I'll provide at the end of this webinar. So now I'm going to share my screen here. So next, I'd like to introduce Shivangi Misra, an International League of People's Struggle and an international human rights lawyer. So she will be discussing an anti-imperialist perspective on Canada's role in NATO-led or NATO-involved wars. And would you like to share your screen, or are you just going to be speaking today, Shivangi?
I will not be using any slide deck. I'll just be speaking.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Joseph, and everyone who's present. It is very energizing to hear about the actions and protests in Brussels, and we're there with you in solidarity. I'm joining you today from the unceded, unsurrendered, and stolen territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Other excellent speakers today, like Joseph, will talk about the history and the current role of NATO in initiating and escalating wars around the world. And I would like to focus on connecting these wars to a greater system of global exploitation that is led by the motive of profiteering and maintaining control of the global economy. Wars deeply and most devastatingly impact the working class people of the world. And in wars of aggression between imperialist powers, for example, between the NATO bloc and Russia, it benefits no one but the rich imperialists of both the countries. And across the world, the Ukrainian people are suffering, the Russian people are suffering, the people of Palestine, Yemen, Haiti, the Philippines, Kashmir are being displaced, brutalized, or are living in chronic poverty as their countries are ravaged by the NATO member states or other US-led wars. So as anti-imperialists, we acknowledge that US is the primary force of global militarization. However, it is not just the US that is to blame. it would not nearly be as successful without its lackeys, the NATO member states as well. And Canada is an enthusiastic junior partner to US imperialism at this moment. And the Canadian economy is located within that very violent and exploitative system. Canada has attempted to disguise itself as a very diverse, respectful country through rewriting its colonial history and past, but its ongoing repression of indigenous nations and its contributions to the world system of imperialism makes it clear the Canadian empire is not the safe haven that it pretends to be. So the very existence of Canada, it began with bloodshed and colonization, which was supported by European colonial empires, removing indigenous people from their lands, entering into agreements that were later not respected, killing animals, means of livelihood, separating children from their parents, possibly, murdering and raping of indigenous women and girls that continues to this date. Canada has continued to exploit its position in the world, riding the coattails of British and American imperialism, and including through its participation in NATO. So Canada has a history of colonial expansion. It has funded imperialist militaries, expanded their presence in the Asia-Pacific region and the South China Sea. Canada is one of the founding members of coalitions of elite countries like G7 and APEC. It directly participates in funding and providing military training and other technical support to authoritative regimes around the world, like the armed forces of the Philippines and the Israeli army, and the so-called Israeli army, so-called Israel. So NATO, the alliance of these 29 states, which is committed to upholding its common imperialist goals, these states came together to shore up the power of capital against the growing power of labor movement and the threat of socialist revolutions. Although the USSR is no more, NATO's modus operandi is still to deter or stop states and movements from deviating from the monopoly capitalism model. It defends an economic system which allows a very small number of companies to exploit, plunder, murder, while keeping most of the working people in the world poor and precarious. So Canada's membership in NATO, it has been draining Canadian taxpayers' funds for increased military spending. It has committed Canada to production and trade in military fare, such as light armored vehicles, armored drones, fighter jets. It has complied Canada to engage in threatening military exercises in the Caribbean, Europe, and East Asia. And it has made Canada party to wars in Syria and Ukraine. It has obligated the Canadian government to join in economic coercive measures, and illegally so, in Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Yemen, and so on. The list goes on. And it makes Canada subservient to US foreign policy and aggression. So, for example, in the most recent defense policy paper, which was released in June 2017, the Canadian government outlined its defense priorities for the next 20 years. And the paper proposed the defense budget per year, which is 18.9, the increase to be from $18.9 billion to $32.7 billion in 2026, which is an increase of over 70%. And the significant costs include over $100 billion to purchase new fighter jets, naval ships, which has been called the largest single taxpayer expense in Canadian history. And these figures not only account for acquiring new weapons. It doesn't even account for the additional billions that would be spent in maintaining these weapons and ammunitions over the cost of their life cycle. So the increased spending is due in large part due to its support for NATO militarism. So since the intensification of the war in Ukraine, the cost of living has skyrocketed, causing both inflation and opportunities for price gouging by businesses. Basic necessities in Canada is more expensive, and it has just provided yet another opportunity for the rich to profit. So in both the war zones and the rest of the world, it is the working people who are paying the price while the ruling class gets rich. And the military budget increases to fund the war abroad, funding, while that's happening, the funding for social services such as healthcare, education, they remain inadequate in our country. And the military is by far the largest polluter and contributor to climate change. And it affects health effects and other devastating and disproportionate impacts on the indigenous community, people around military camps, women, all vulnerable groups in the world. Military recruitment in schools It targets the youth who believe that they have no other opportunity to escape poverty, all while the Canadian military continues to foster a culture of misogyny and white supremacy within its ranks. So let's talk about the most recent conflict in the interest of time. Not only does the NATO continue to fuel the war in Ukraine at the moment, it is in part responsible for causing it in the first place. So despite the dissolution of the USSR and the Warsaw Act and the establishment of the Russian Federation in line with the Western capitalist policy, NATO expansion has still continued. So NATO powers provoke Russia and push for remilitarization of Europe. And NATO and Russia's actions are motivated by competition for natural resources and by NATO powers' desire to establish control over the former socialist economies of Eastern Europe alongside Russia's desire to do the same. So Western powers have sought the integration of Eastern European economies into a capitalist system. Ukraine is rich in minerals. It is a crucial area for transportation of oil and gas to Europe. It is these considerations which weigh in on the ruling classes of Russia and the NATO powers, rather than the security and the well-being of us, the working people of the world. So by recklessly provoking conflict and then taking advantage of it, NATO has proved that its interests are fundamentally incompatible with the interest of the ordinary working people like us. In Hungary, Baltic states, and in 2008, it did announce its intention to extend NATO membership to Georgia and Ukraine, knowing full well that this would represent a direct threat to the Russian Federation. And even in the 90s, many realized that continued NATO expansion risked remilitarization of Europe, of Eastern Europe, and provoking conflict. And because Russia is an imperialist power at the moment, it is no surprise that Russia has eventually responded to the extension of military alliance to its doorstep. And these threats are not an abstract one. These threat means stationing missiles within reach of Russian cities, regular military exercises on Russian borders, withdrawal of US and NATO powers from arms control agreements, as well as increasing intervention in Ukrainian domestic policy. And the latter significantly impacts Russia's political and economic interest. So NATO's expansion thus confronts Russia with the direct threat of violence and foreign political influence. And for the rest of us, the war between the imperialist powers achieves nothing but death, destruction, and impoverishment. So I'll conclude by quickly here, and we can have a discussion at the end. But so by participating in NATO, Canada basically is perpetuating the ongoing devastation in Ukraine by continuing to send lethal weapons to Ukraine, training fascist Ukrainian militias, and promoting NATO membership for Ukraine. And the ordinary people have to pay a price for that. It is a threat to security, it is an obstacle to peace, and Canada must withdraw from NATO. Because our government, our Canadian government, is not working for people's interest by supporting NATO, but it is pouring money into weapons and turning countries into war zones, all to uphold a broken system. And there can never be real peace as long as the system rules us. So as anti-imperialist in Canada, it is our job to join with the working classes of the world in opposing imperialist wars such as this, and to take a stand against our own ruling class in Canada that perpetuates it. Just so many Russian people have, similar to how Russian people have taken a stand against their own warmongering ruling class, it is up to us to stand against the Canadian ruling class. And despite what the Canadian government says, the Canada's involvement in this war economy is not for defense, but rather to protect and maintain its imperialist interest in the world. So there is an urgent need to build an anti-war movement in our countries. So Canada must get out of NATO. It must support all the support and technical support to authoritative regimes all over the world, and it must stop arms trading for profit. Thank you.
Wonderful. For running such clear and concise information of the ways Canada's involvement in NATO is a threat and impacts the health of Canadians due to its membership in NATO, draining taxpayers' contributions and putting them towards weapons and ammunition over necessities like our education, health, and Indigenous rights to clean water and climate crisis. So I appreciate that, and calls to action. Calls to action will be included in the handout because they're incredible and things that all of us should take away from this webinar. Thank you so much. So thank you so much. Now I will move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Tamara Lawrence. She's a Wilf Canada member, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, senior researcher and campaigner, and she'll be discussing the climate crisis and NATO. So take it away.
So good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all and to NATO activists virtually. And a big thanks to the organizers. I'm speaking to you from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples. But I'm also with you all in Brussels in spirit and solidarity. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about NATO in the context of the climate crisis. As you know from the headlines this week, we saw the hottest days ever recorded on planet Earth. And since May, Canada has experienced the worst forest fires ever. Over 3,400 forest fires and 8 million hectares have burnt so far this year. These are climate-induced forest fires exacerbated by heat waves and drought across the country. The Canadian Forest Service describes it as record-breaking, unprecedented, and off the charts. Thousands of people have been evacuated from their homes and communities. Hundreds of houses and businesses have been destroyed. Smoke blanketed North America, making it difficult for people to go outside and to even breathe. There are still 648 active fires across the country, and 339 of them are out of control, and we are only at the start of fire season. What is happening in Canada is happening around the world. Europe and Asia are currently in the grief of a heat wave, and there's terrible flooding in Spain. We are in a climate emergency. And really, NATO has been absolutely useless and exacerbating it. Remember, we are only at 1.1 degrees of global mean temperature rise. In March, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their sixth assessment report, and they explained that at our current rate of carbon emissions globally, they predict with high or very high confidence that we are on track to reach 3 to 4 degrees of global mean temperature rise by 2100 in the next 7 years. This is catastrophic in our lifetime and in the lifetime of our children and grandchildren. The IPCC scientists said that we need urgent climate action to secure a livable planet. And we have to rapidly reduce emissions by at least half in the next 7 years, and we need massive investments in climate action and climate justice. Now, as the fires were raging across Canada and smoke-choking people from Calgary to New York City, NATO was conducting its largest Air Force exercise, Air Defender 2023. It was held over a 2-week period from June 12th to 23rd. Over 250 warplanes and 10,000 personnel were involved. Bombers and fighter jets, including the F-35s, were flying from Germany all throughout NATO's eastern flank and up and down Russia's border. This exercise dangerously inflames tensions with Russia, and it also exacerbates the climate crisis. Military vehicles like warplanes are extremely carbon intensive. One flight of an F-35 burns more fuel than a car consumes in a year. And the cost of operating an F-35 for 2 hours is the cost. The salary for a nurse or a teacher. In January of this year, Canada's Defense Minister Anita announced that Canada would buy the F-35 for $70 billion over the next 8 years. Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, United Kingdom, Italy, Finland, most recently Romania have bought these American fossil fuel-powered, highly flawed warplanes. This past Wednesday, Chatham House held a webinar entitled Combating Climate Change, NATO's role in building climate resilience, with Canada's ambassador to NATO, David Angel, and the Lieutenant Richard Nugent of the British Ministry of Defence. And they admitted that there are no renewable energy alternatives for military vehicles like fighter aircraft in the near term. That means NATO countries are locking themselves into fuel-powered militarism for decades, and they have no plans to offset their emissions and achieve net zero. NATO is contributing not to climate resilience, but to climate breakdown. At the NATO summit in Madrid last year, Canada announced that it would host NATO's climate change and security center of excellence in Montreal, Quebec. The center is not open yet, but it's expected to be opening soon. But the center is really an effort by Canada to help greenwash NATO. And Canada is not a leader in climate action at all. In fact, Canada is one of the worst climate polluters on the planet. Our carbon emissions have been going up and up over the past 60 years. And Canada has failed to meet every single target under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And Canada also has the largest, dirtiest oil and gas development on the planet. It's the tar sands in Alberta, and this is also where Canada has its largest and busiest Air Force base, CFB Cold Lake. Yesterday, at a pre-summit press conference in Brussels, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that he welcomed NATO's new defense spending estimates that shows a real increase of 8.3% in 2023. I'll put a link in the chat to NATO's latest defense expenditures report. He also said in this press conference that this is the biggest increase in decades and the ninth consecutive year of increases in military spending. European allies and Canada have invested over $450 billion extra US dollars since they agreed to the Defense Investment Pledge in 2014 in Wales. Yet, friends, while NATO countries have increased their collective military budgets by over $450 billion to NATO pledge to help development adapt to the climate crisis. Military spending is on the agenda at the Vilnius Summit. Stoltenberg said that the 2% GDP target for military spending is a floor, not a ceiling, and that there is now an expectation that members exceed it and reach 2.5% as Romania has. As you may know, CIPRI showed that global military spending is $2.2 trillion, and NATO accounts for 60% of this, and it's really driving this growth. Yet this is the same amount of money, $2.2 trillion, that is needed to deal with the climate emergency. NATO's constant demand to increase military spending is depriving countries from having the resources to deal with the forest fires, flooding and heat waves, droughts and sandstorms. Finally, I want you to consider that when the Kyoto Protocol came out in 1997, the United States refused to sign and ratify it. Instead, at that time, as Joseph explained, the U.S. pushed NATO expansion and led the illegal NATO military intervention against the former Yugoslavia, the bombing and breaking up of that country. For 25 years, NATO's carbon-intensive, costly wars, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine, have exacerbated the climate emergency and have derailed all attempts to tackle it. The war in Ukraine is a NATO war, as Shivangi said. The U.S. led coup in 2014 that helped start it, and it is going to prevent the international community from achieving the Paris Agreement and limiting global mean temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. In its sixth assessment report that came out in March, the IPCC said in a dozen places that international cooperation is needed to tackle the climate emergency. That means we need to end the war in Ukraine, stop these conflicts with Russia and China, lay down our arms and collaborate with these countries on our most crucial common security challenge, and that is climate change. So NATO is the greatest threat to the people and to the planet. It is urgent that we disband it. We must be calling on all of our countries to withdraw. I want to urge you to bring a copy of the latest IPCC report, along with a copy of the Women for Peace United Against NATO's excellent declaration to your elected officials. We have to demilitarize and disarm to decarbonize and decolonize. Finally, I want to let you know that there are rallies being being held across Canada calling for Canada to withdraw and for NATO to be abolished. Tomorrow I'll be in Toronto with many other people protesting against NATO, stop the war in Ukraine, and we'll be meeting outside of the US consulate office. Stop the wars, stop the warming, stop NATO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for sharing all of that information and statistics and discussing catastrophic climate change in connection to NATO. It's wild to hear that the 2% GDP target for military spending is being pushed to no longer be a floor, but to be or no longer be a ceiling, but a floor. And as we learned that the 2.2 trillion that's needed for climate crisis is being misdirected towards arms and war. And I really appreciate you sharing this urgent need to demilitarize, to decarbonize and decolonize. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing all that. Next, I'm going to be moving on to our last speaker for today. So our last speaker is Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, and she will be discussing possible future scenarios for ruptures within NATO and how our movement can position itself to gain strength. So welcome Medea, and we'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Ali. And this has been a really excellent webinar so far. I really appreciate the great history that Joseph laid out, Shivangi explaining how the NATO goals have been to the needs of working people, and tomorrow bringing up the critical issues of the environment, because that's so important when we look forward about how are we going to build a strong movement. I want to just throw out some mostly kind of random things about what I see happening right now around NATO, and then hopefully we can have more of a discussion of how we take advantage of some of these divisions. First, let's of course recognize that for the moment, NATO is extremely strong, in that before the war in Ukraine, there were questions about whether NATO was really needed. And now not only do we see countries in Europe and putting more money into their militaries and trying to reach this floor of 2%, but we also see the addition of Finland, potentially Sweden, and much more synchronization within NATO of the militaries. And of course, NATO is learning a lot, learning in quotes, about how to fight together using the Ukrainian people as the cannon fodder. A lot of NATO's future does depend on how this war plays out. But we are already seeing many cracks happening, and potential ones, as this war drags on. Some of them relate to the sanctions on Russia, which have hurt NATO countries themselves. The blowback on the sanctions of energy has really hurt a lot of businesses in Europe. For some time, there were subsidies to help those businesses and consumers, but those have dried up, and we're going to see increases in inflation and protests in Europe against the rising costs of living. We saw in our meeting in Vienna recently that had representatives of more than 32 countries, how there is an increase in the anti-war sentiment that many of the peace groups are building on to try to get people out into the streets and increase the opposition to NATO. We also see, unfortunately, many groups and political parties on the right who are taking advantage of this as well. And this is something that we should be concerned about, with the increase of nationalist sentiments that are coming out as a result of the war in Ukraine and NATO's activities. We see divisions inside NATO, with countries like Turkey actually increasing their trade with Russia Russia during this time. We see that in Hungary and Greece, for example, some of their most important banks and companies have actually been sanctioned by Ukraine, and they have tried, Hungarian and Greek companies had tried to retaliate by trying to block money going for the military aid to Ukraine. And we see internal divisions that will come out in Vilnius in terms of how to deal with Ukraine and its possible ascension into NATO. But so let's recognize divisions inside NATO countries, within those countries themselves, and within political parties themselves that are to move forward with the issue of Ukraine. I think we also will see more resentment of NATO countries towards the United States, more questions about whether Europe should be a U.S. lapdog when it comes to their foreign policy. Many countries questioning whether this is actually good for European security for the long term, more talk about the need for European security architecture outside the framework of the United States. And I think this will really be increased, as Joseph implied, when it comes to China, because here we see already public disagreement with the United States towards its attitude on China economically, European businesses not wanting their countries to be following the U.S. policies when it comes to China. I also think increased U.S. resentment when it comes to energy, that Europeans are understanding how these sanctions on Russian energy have actually benefited U.S. dirty oil companies, gas companies, how the replacement of Russian energy by U.S. energy has led to tremendous price increases, price gouging by U.S. companies. I think there's also divisions about the tremendous increase in profits that U.S. companies are getting from NATO increased money spent on weapons. There are also European weapons companies that want to take advantage and get access to that money and not have it, so much of it going to U.S. companies. And these divisions will only increase. In the United States, around the war in Ukraine, because of the tremendous media support for NATO, there was a lot of U.S. general public support for NATO. That has started to erode, and we see in public opinion polls the U.S. together to be in election in the U.S. Previously, a monopoly pretty much by the Biden administration and the hawks, who are almost all the Republican Party, except for a group on the extreme right of the Republican questioning the U.S. role in NATO. Now we have bigger cracks being evidenced. We have Donald Trump, who is running for president again, who says that if he were elected, he would pick up the phone and immediately talk to his good friends Zelensky and Putin and solve this problem. We have DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida, running in the Republican Party as well, who originally said this was more of a European problem that they should solve, got a lot of pushback from Republicans on that, but still says he is in favor of a ceasefire. On the Democratic side, we have Robert F. Kennedy, who is running for president, who has an extremely good position when it comes to NATO, pointing out NATO's role in setting up the context for this crisis and calling for peace talks and negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. And then we have the Green Party candidate for president. Well, he's a candidate for the Green Party, and that is Cornel West, who also has NATO and calls for peace talks when it comes. Recently, that there have been talks going on between former U.S. national security officials and prominent members of national security of the Russian think tanks, Russian academics, but they have also been joined, at least on one occasion, by Russia's Foreign Affairs Minister Lavrov. I think these talks, which have been focused on how are they going to wind down this war, shows the worries inside the Biden administration about how this war in Ukraine and U.S. support for it is going to affect the upcoming elections. We also know that in May, the CIA Director William Burns went to Ukraine to talk to Zelensky about how we're going to wind down this war by the end of the year. So this shows that within the Biden administration, there is also a lot of division about how to move forward. These things are things that we must take advantage of as we build up a peace movement. When we met in Vienna, we talked about a global week of actions, September 30th to October 8th, to show growing global calls. We also talk about how we need to support the efforts that are coming from so many different quarters that are calling for peace talks, whether it's the 6 countries in Africa led by South Africa, the Pope's initiative, the Chinese proposal, the effort by President Lula of Brazil to create a peace club. All of these are things that we must support. So I look forward to a robust discussion on how we can take advantage of these divisions internally within NATO, how we can look at the upcoming Vilnius summit and the divisions about how to offer or not offer membership in NATO for Ukraine, and how this can support a growing movement, not only to call for peace talks and negotiations in Ukraine, but how we can call individually for our countries to get out of NATO, and how we can call collectively for an end to NATO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for covering so many important topics regarding the future scenarios for rupture, such as the increase in anti-war sentiment that many peace groups are building on to mobilize people and Europeans' understanding of how sanctions in Russia are actually benefiting U.S. energy, as well as acknowledging the other side of the continued concern of nationalist sentiments from NATO's activities in the war in Ukraine. So thank you so much for your extensive knowledge there. We appreciate your insights and closing the speakers panelists of the organized talks. So now we're going to move on to our question and answer period. I'm going to pass things over to Anne to moderate this discussion. I ask that you raise your hand if you have a question that you'd like to ask, or to put your question in the chat. And I will be moving on to Anne for our first question from Tamara, which is, do we know if there are any protests planned in Vilnius? Also, I'd love to know or to hear more how the meeting at NATO headquarters went from Anne and Ula. So here's to you.
Well, great. And we'd like to call Ula up to answer both of those questions. Come on up, Ula.
To not acknowledge the whole group. We would never have been here without Nancy and George and Leah and Skevi and Anne and all the wonderful women sitting here today. So let's agree on doing it together. It's we, not some persons. Okay. What was the question? Vilnius. Yes, there were some tries to get a small group, mainly from Sweden, some young radical people from Finland. But I think that they realized that there wouldn't be any attention to them. So the money would more or less have been wasted to go there. I'm a little bit disappointed because I thought there was more power behind it, but we have a challenge for Washington next year. Bring it together, we come. But about the NATO visit, which was, by the way, done by Leah after a long try to get some contacts. She got the contacts with a Finnish woman. I don't remember her name, and I don't have to remember it. And her assistant, and they said that we could come with 9 persons, which is why we were then 10, because we pushed her to take Leah as the coordinator, as the 10th person. And we were supposed to meet this woman who had some smaller role in the NATO hierarchy. But we were, the night before the event, we were upgraded. They had obviously read the list that it was not only a group of crazy Finnish women, there were also Anne and Australia, and the group was very international. So we were upgraded to meet Nicola DeSantis, who was one of the bosses, the directors of public diplomacy. There was some happening, so we were a bit late, but he excused us. And then he started his lecture on NATO, how wonderful it is, how it's working for peace and freedom and democracy and blah, blah, blah. And then we nicely told him that we know the story of NATO, we have studied it. And we got then our small speeches. So every woman in the group got the 1-2 minutes to bring their message, which were all very critical, of course, and which made him a little bit uncomfortable. So he was so polite and so smiley when we came, but then we saw a certain aggression in his way to treat us. And finally we then stood up and left when he tried to push us about how terrible Milosevic was and how terrible Putin is and how terrible all the other ones except NATO is. So we then left with the honor and our lives, and we were not arrested. But as a joke, I could tell you that when I got my turn to speak, I said that as a grandmother, I'm used to tell fairy tales for my grandchildren, and they love it and they believe in them. And now we have heard the fairy tale of NATO, but the problem is that adults do not believe in fairy tales, and we are adult women. So the fairy tale of NATO was not ours. That's about what the NATO audience, not audience, meeting was. Thank you.
And from our audience here, who has a question for one of our panelists?
Just 1 second, Anne. We just have Sally here that's had her hand up since the webinar started. So
Okay.
thank you. Sally, you're welcome to share your question now.
You're muted, Sally.
Sally, can you unmute yourself? Oh, Sally, are you there? Well, while we're waiting for Sally, are there questions from this audience? Okay, come right on up. And we'll see if Sally will come on.
She's unmuted.
I'm here.
Okay. Sally, go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't expect to be called on immediately, but I am calling for an immediate response. Let me say, in my professional life, I've been retired a long time. I was a preschool teacher, which I considered, in a way, a part of the peace movement. When little children learn to get along with each other with their teacher's guidance, they're contributing to peace, 20, 30, 50 years out. And cluster bombs is what has hit me this morning. They kill children. because a lot of them don't explode, and the child seeds, I believe they're yellow usually. This yellow little blob that looks like maybe a balloon or a ball, and they pick them up, and maybe they already even killed their faces, their hands are blown apart. So I am astonished and absolutely enraged that Joe Biden is taking that step, which I understand the rest of NATO has been appalled and has been opposed to this step. So once again, the United States of America takes the lead at being the worst of the worst about war. And I, as an American citizen, I oppose that.
Thank you, Sally, and
with every marrow of my body.
good for you. And let's have Medea answer that, because I think Code Pink is trying to stop the Biden administration from doing that. Medea, would you like to comment?
I put it in the chat. We need to do something immediate. We need to go to the streets, and I don't know how we do that because even the peace movement has decided we have to plan things, and that is all wonderful and well and good, but
yeah, well, I think Medea has a part of the solution for you. Medea, go ahead.
In terms of the cluster bomb issue, there were only, I would say, 19 members of Congress who just came out with a letter opposing it. But, these are also the members of Congress who approve of the $110 billion going to Ukraine and all the other weapons going. There is a amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, Sarah Jacobs and Ilhan Omar, members of Congress, Sarah Jacobs and Ilhan Omar, that we have been supporting and trying to get it to be a bipartisan amendment, but and that would be to try to override this, but it's very unlikely that this will happen. I think it shows the depravity of the Biden administration. I think it shows the desperation of this administration that knows that Ukrainian counteroffensive isn't going anywhere. And I think it's one more issue that we must use to build up opposition to this war and to NATO. The fact that almost every NATO country, I think, except the US and Finland, has signed on to the convention to ban cluster munitions, and yet are not coming out screaming and saying, no, we can't allow that to happen, shows how the US runs NATO and how those are all of our allies in Europe really have to step up and distance themselves from the US.
And would you put in the chat the link to the petition that Code Pink has put up?
Yeah, sure.
Cluster munitions.
Good.
Okay, let's see.
May I make a little reply? Yep. I'm really talking about stepping.
Yeah, organizing your community. Let's get going.
Well, but I mean, we were on this call. We must on this Zoom. We must represent some different peace and justice movements, and we need.
Okay.
I feel this is a key.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we'll keep working on it, and we do need to organize and get moving on this because cluster bombs may start moving very quickly.
Can we have a declaration or something, a statement?
Well, yeah, let's do a statement. Yeah. But yeah.
Webinar.
Let's do. Okay.
Oh yeah, I have a question for the panel. Do you think the military in USA think they will win the war like not the Minister of Defense of Norway, but the military leader of Norway? He said this war we cannot win the first 5 years. So this is his attitude. So when they say that they maybe will finish the war in 1 year, I don't believe them. And the bad news, one other question I have. Turkey said on the BBC, the president of Turkey said that they want Ukraine to be member of NATO, but first they need to get a peace agreement with Russia, he said, with Putin. Comment on this. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Okay, would one of the panelists like to take that? Tamara?
I fear that we are at the start of a long war against Russia. I would like to urge people to read Stephen F. Cohen's important book that came out in 2019, the year before he passed away. Stephen F. Cohen, of course, was the preeminent expert on US-Russia relations, on Russian-Soviet history, and US foreign policy. And the war he died is called War with Russia, ? From Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. And I'd urge people to read it. But he argues that the United States and NATO were laying the groundwork for a long war against Russia. And it's analogous to the illegal NATO bombing of the former Yugoslavia that led to the breakup of the country. And many analysts have been talking about this plan to dismember Russia. Russia is the largest country on the planet with immense natural resource wealth, as well as financial wealth. It has an incredible sovereign wealth fund from its oil and gas sector. Canada and the United States, which are also petrostates, don't have a sovereign wealth fund. So Russia has a lot of wealth, and this is what the capitalists, the political elite of the NATO countries are interested in. And this goes to what Shivangi said. So I just want to urge you to get this book and read it if you haven't. It's extremely important. War with Russia by Stephen F. Cohen. And I think Joseph has his hand up.
Yes, go ahead, Joseph.
So I think we need to understand what's happening in the context of both Zelensky's and Putin's and Austin's goal of breaking the Russian military. We know that the counteroffensive has stalled. I think that it helps to explain in large measure why they're moving forward with the cluster bombs to try to find some desperate way to break the Russian defenses. And the reality is that, and it's most unlikely to happen, the Russians are prepared for a very long war. I think the events of 10 days ago or so with Prigozhin, failed to fundamentally weaken Putin. And the Russians will fight this for a long time. I think that as the counteroffensive stalls, that puts us in a better position in terms of our demanding ceasefire and negotiations. And I think in time the U.S. elite and others will recognize that there's some limits to what can be achieved here, and I think that provides an opening for us to really push hard for a peaceful and as just as possible resolution of the war.
Thank you. Further questions from our audience here? Come on up, Patricia.
Introduce yourself.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Patrizia Sterpetti, Wilf Italy, and my answer is for Jeffrey Jefferson, because you speak about Organization for Security and Cooperation as a proposal for this next conference in 2025. So I know that because there is a group of women that start in 2015 to organize a presence of the civil society in OSCE, because before they are not a dialogue in the presence of the civil society inside. And this woman criticized the fact that they are different branch: human rights, economy, environment, and security. The women can speak about security. They tell that it's important to analyze all these matters together. And I see that recently, last month, the OSCE recognized that the instruments of arbitrage arbitrage is not used. This is the demonstration that we don't use diplomacy, but just we improve militarism. So I think that your point is really important about this new idea about security, human security. And is this, and I want to add that about NATO, in Italy, now we have one referendum to block the sending arms to Ukraine. We have a proposal for the objection of the military spending. And we have a problem about environment, because the law for environment, the law 1052 of 2006, don't include the military activity. So this is a bigger problem for the environment and for the health. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in here and say, obviously, all of the baskets, all those images, all those issues apply to women. The idea of compartmentalizing makes absolutely no sense. There's the old slogan that women hold up half of the sky. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. And women certainly deserve to be, and it's in all of our interest to have women engaged really across the boards. Then to say that I think it's not fully understood quite how serious the collapse of the European security architecture leading up to and during this war is. The loss of any kind of strategic stability, the increased dangers of nuclear war, compounded by AI and other technologies. So I think it's important for us to understand, in addition to the climate emergency, which Tamara spoke about so well, for us to be understanding just how desperate this situation is. One of the ways to begin to deal with it, I mean, the governments who've been a part of the OSCE have really pulled back. OSCE doesn't have much money in the context of global confrontation. It doesn't have deep government engagement, but that can change. In terms of who might host an OSCE meeting, Finland is no longer, out of the Helsinki process. Finland is no longer a likely candidate, now having joined NATO. But we think here in terms of Austria, we think here in terms of Ireland as possible hosts. So it could move forward. We had a conversation, Rainer Braun and I had a conversation with Ambassador Kemet about maybe a month and a half ago, focused mostly on the TPNW, but also I raised with him the possibility of an OSCE meeting in 2025 that could begin to lay the groundwork for restoration of strategic stability, the beginning of negotiations for a new Euro-Atlantic security architecture. And what he said was, the way to make it happen is for people in our respective countries to begin talking about, begin pushing governments to be open to it. And I think the deeper we go into a stalemate in the Ukraine war, much as Medea was talking about earlier, in terms of opening cracks in the system, we can push forward, I think, to try to reconvene the OSCE. Common security is not everything we want. I mean, in some ways it relies on military power. But I think the reality is, given how dangerous and desperate the situation is, we need to be talking about common security, educating about common security, and pushing for those negotiations that will at least create a firebreak between the great powers.
Thank you, Joseph. And I'll just make a comment on something that you said about, women holding half the sky, and leading into NATO trying to co-opt feminist foreign policy, which Claire Daly railed about when we met with her on Thursday. We had a really, really good conversation at the European Parliament with Claire Daly and a member of Parliament from Germany. And both of them were saying, really watch out, because NATO is using, the women, security, And, we've had this idea of feminist foreign policy to try to get cooperation, all of this into foreign policy, but that's not the way NATO looks at it. they want some warmongering women in there to help get these wars going. Also, Nancy Price mentioned in the chat, let's not forget about depleted uranium if we're talking about cluster bombs. And we have had two excellent presentations. Ria made one earlier, and we had one of our colleagues from Italy that made another one. So we've covered that. Ula, I believe you had something.
First of all, Joseph, I don't agree with you about half the sky. I think we carry more. We carry 70% at least. But then for the OSCE thing, President Niinistö, the Finnish president, in 2020, I recall, a suggestion for a new Helsinki summit in 2025, which is the celebration of 75th celebration of OSCE. It was a very good suggestion. And Leah and I took the initiative to support this now totally gone mad president. And we made a call to European organizations to support this. And we sent it to the president, to the parliament, to OSCE, to all OSCE countries and so on. It was signed by some 140 organizations. Then when we started to hear the suspicion that Finland was going into NATO, we made a new call, which was signed by organizations from all over. We had very little time. We had less European, but more international organizations. And we sent that again to all these blah, blah, blah organizations and institutes. We went to the Finnish foreign minister, yes, and we had also a German guy with us. And Pekka Haavisto, green in brackets and in whatever it's called. He was formerly, I was the vice chair under Pekka in the 90s. We were good friends. We traveled very much in Russia. We built up a lot of relations there. But then he changed because he wanted to be a foreign minister. So he changed his opinion on NATO, on nuclear power, and many other things. And we asked Pekka, how about the OSCE conference? We brought the latest organization's signatures there. And he looked down, and then he said that it can't be done because the Russians would not allow media to be on place, and they wouldn't allow non-governmental organizations to take part. And I say, Pekka, we give a damn about taking part. We can have a counter summit or a side event besides. We don't have to be integrated in the governmental process. We never got an answer. So now we should push. We have a real good layer there, bottom there, to start pushing organizations again, to take the drive, and we can use Claire Daly. Thank you.
Any more questions from our audience? Ernest, please.
I have a question.
Okay. Yep. I don't know who it is online. Please go ahead.
It's Medea. I have a question for both Tamara and Shivangi. In terms of the Canadian cracks in political parties or governments, are there any people in NDP or anywhere who are starting to speak out and call for negotiations? And then I have a question for Joseph on this recent news about people like Richard Haas and others being involved in this track 2 discussions, or what they're calling track 1.5, because they've also talked to government officials. How important do you think that is?
Joseph, you want to answer first?
Yeah, so I look, it's hopeful. There have been a number of track 2 discussions going on, really since even before the invasion. it provides a means for elites to communicate. And I think the fact that Lavrov showed up, was particularly significant. I don't think anything's going to happen fast, but it provides a foundation for discussions that can be built from. One of likely many. But the fact that Lavrov thought to and has added to credibility of the discussion, and to both speak to and to hear from people in the U.S. elites, I think is significant. And I think as you and others have done through Code Pink and the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, simply letting people know that it has happened is a way, I think, to build out support for ceasefire negotiations.
Thank you. And Tamara, go ahead and answer, please.
Okay, so there are no members of parliament or senators who are calling for, a ceasefire, stopping weapons to Ukraine and an end to the war, and no political party is calling for Canada to withdraw from NATO. So it's disappointing that we don't have any parliamentarian who we can work with. However, we have a fairly strong peace movement of 40 organizations that have been working hard for a decade to oppose NATO, and we have been relentless in our public appeals in the media, on the street, to parliamentarians, that we want Canada out of NATO and we want the alliance to be abolished. And I think there's a lot of strength there, and we keep pushing to try to get the cracks going. So I'll turn it over to Shubhangi. I see that she has her hand.
Thank you, Tamara. But I'll just reiterate what you said. There are currently no political parties which are asking for peace and calling out for peace. In fact, NDP, Medea, you mentioned NDP in February 2023, this year, the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine, they released a statement which called for more sanctions on Russia. They called out the Liberal Party, which is the ruling government of the day, that they're not doing enough to sanction Russia, did not call out for peace, called out for a win in this war, which rests on the premise that this war is inevitable. And so there is very little support for peace from the NDP, which is the supposed progressive party of the country. And they stand for Ukrainian democracy. The statement was good, but in the end, it basically asked for more Canadian support. And the Canadian support technically would mean supporting more arms, weapons. And currently, the Liberal Party, for example, it facilitates more arms support. The support for Israel, for example, reached a 30-year high this year. I see Barbara Waldron's comment that the two Communist Party in Canada, yes, the Communist Party of Canada and the Communist Party of Canada, ML, have called for peace, but the NDP is not one of them. So, thank you.
Thank you. And we have Ernest, who's with the International Peace Bureau and from Ghana, who has a question for you.
Thank you. So I have a question and an opinion as well. My question first is this fight for NATO has been so long, and we are trying to look for a solution to end the world's problems. Lives are being lost, things are being destroyed, monies are being pumped into the government to make sure we make peace, yet we are not having peace. But the question is there a way to solve this problem from a different perspective? Probably we might want to look at another way or an alternative way of making NATO change their mind, that is, if possible. And my opinion is probably if America was, we can make America stop exerting their power over NATO, because I think, from my opinion, Americans are trying to take possession, to exert their power over all the countries, and we're using their powers with their influences. They are making things worse every day, every night, and things are not getting better anymore. So if there is an alternative way of making NATO change their mind, probably we might have to consider that and try other options as well, since the time is running. Thank you.
Can I address that?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the ways in the long term is that what some might call the global south, and I hear now is being called the global majority, which I actually like better, is going to assert itself, and NATO will become obsolete. What in my presentation I didn't talk about is that kind of movement coming from outside of NATO, whether you look at the power of the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the de-dollarization. All of these efforts are making the US weaker and making NATO weaker. So I think the real way that we're going to see a demise of NATO is by the assertion of the global majority that this dangerous, aggressive military alliance is hurting the entire world, and that we are creating alternative organizations for cooperation that will eventually overtake NATO.
Thank you.
Could I also add just really quickly that I also always remind people that NATO is an alliance, a military alliance led by the United States with only 31 country members. Most of the planet is not in NATO. 163 countries are not in NATO. And we need to take it upon ourselves to provide the alternative. The alternative is peace and cooperation through the United Nations system. When I went to Vienna for the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine, I brought 200 pins with me that said, "No to NATO, yes to peace and cooperation." And I also have a big purple pink banner that says the same thing, "No to NATO, peace and cooperation." And every country that I go to, I find the Canadian embassy and I stand outside the Canadian embassy with my banner. So friends, we need to be we need to just be relentless in our opposition to NATO. We need to delegitimize it and give the alternative to the public. Because as Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia, said, NATO is the greatest threat to peace and security in the world today.
Well, and I would make a suggestion that we might consider the name of our group now the Global Majority Women and Men Against NATO. Okay, let's see. Shivangi, and then we'll go to Mary Jane, and then I think that will be at the end of our hour and a half. So
Shivangi, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I agree with all the speakers on the panel about building an anti-war movement, building coalitions which stand up in opposition of NATO with education, mobilizing, and action. But also like these, the profiteers, the war profiteers, the warmongers, they are present in each and every country, the capitalist ruling class. So for example, the largest shareholder in Lockheed Martin is BlackRock, which is also the largest landlord of single family homes in the US. So these are all connected, and it is a part of a global system of exploitation. So we also address these by attacking them where they are present, where they are investing with these shareholders, naming and shaming campaigns. These are all effective strategies of opposing NATO, because it is the same people, a very few families and a very few companies that are profiting from these wars of aggression. So thank you. I just wanted to end on that note.
thank you. And let's have Mary Jane, and then I think Ali will end our session for us. So Mary Jane, go ahead, please.
The reason that I'm against NATO is because of their clause saying that if any country is
attacked, we're going to have war, and we're going to have probably nuclear war. So it's really a question of nuclear weapons. And we haven't really mentioned nuclear at all in this meeting today, when the whole problem of the whole world is that we've got nuclear weapons. So my question, if I had a question for someone, would be, are we in connection with ICAN and all of the nuclear abolition groups? That's what we have to do, is get rid of nuclear weapons. And I think we would have more people in our group, our Women Against NATO group, if we would talk about nuclear weapons.
And we have talked about them in other sessions. They didn't come up here, but if any of our panelists want to mention it, but we have had several presentations on it in other weapons.
Show this one.
Okay, here we go. NATO Nuclear Armed Terror Organization. There we go. Joseph, why don't you go ahead, and then Ali, if you'll close the session, please.
So just to say, in my presentation, I did make the point that NATO is a nuclear alliance, right? And, you know, one of the challenges, I mean, I'm working at this point with ICAN in trying to bring people together at the time of the TPNW second meeting in New York in November. And with IPB, we'll be organizing events that will look at the relationship between the increasing great power confrontations, inclusive of NATO, and the increasing dangers of nuclear war. You know, I think one of the challenges that we face is that groups like ICAN don't want to deal with questions of imperialism or the history of the use of nuclear weapons as nuclear blackmail. I mean, Putin didn't invent this. The United States has done this on more than 30 occasions, beginning with the Iran crisis in 1946. So I think we need to understand what we used to call the deadly connection between nuclear war and wars of foreign intervention, and to recognize that, you know, the U.S. is the predominant nuclear power in NATO, but, you know, with NATO's nuclear sharing, we have not only 6 other countries that are in possession of nuclear weapons, but all the other NATO countries are committed to assisting that. So we need to understand, and as Mary Jane was saying, try to build links to people in the anti-nuclear movement, so we can build our strength on both sides.
Thank you, Joseph. And Ali, if you'll go ahead, and then if you'll stay on after Ali ends this session, we have a few more things that we may just tell the people in the audience about what we'll be doing tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. So we appreciate all of you who took the time to join us today for our webinar, and a big special thank you to all of our panelists, Medea Benjamin, Shivangi Misra, Tamara Lawrence, and Joseph Gerson. We're grateful for everything that you shared with us today and providing actions for our participants to leave with today to make change. I believe that together we can rise to the occasion and make a difference. And in addition, I'd like to thank my amazing co-host, Ann Wright, for doing an excellent job moderating this webinar with me. We hope that you all have a lovely weekend ahead of you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for bringing this all together. We've had a wonderful day, a jam-packed day again, with lots of webinars, lots of opportunity to talk with each other about all of the issues that we're facing. Tomorrow, we'll be moving to a different location, and before we do, we just want to again acknowledge all the great work that our friends from Verde and come on, everybody from Verde, come on up.
Maybe I use the time now for maybe 2 announcements, because we all the time since we started yesterday morning we have everything recorded. We have 2 technicians that took care of that, and so we hope soon to distribute it through the mail, and we thank them, of course, and we will also send the links to because it's several films. It's not one long film. That wouldn't be interesting. So we will distribute, where you can find the recordings. And hopefully many more people can see it then. And we have as well the footage of the rally is like a 5-minute footage of the rally we did in Brussels yesterday against increasing military spending. This is already, if you go on the Facebook page of No to War, No to NATO, you can already find it and see it. This we also will distribute, and maybe at the end of this Zoom session, because our main technician is away, so we have to take care of that self, but we can try to show it and to share it with you. It's like 5 minutes, but anyhow, it will be also distributed, and I make publicity for that as well. There's the Global Peace Wave now already. I think it started this noon, and so it will continue until tomorrow noon. No, later than I think in the afternoon, something like that. But anyhow, this footage will also be shown and introduced tomorrow at 1:50 p.m. 2 p.m. I think it's p.m. I hope it is p.m. because we have to introduce it, Ulla and me. I think it's p.m. Anyway, so this is what I wanted to say, and as I said, maybe at the end of the Zoom, we will again try to show you the film on the Zoom.
I have one practical announcement. Somebody lost their glasses. Nobody? Glasses, yeah, here. Spectacles.
So this is.
Yeah.
This is the Global Peace Wave publicity, but it's organized by International Peace Bureau and the World Beyond War, as you know.
Thank you. And again, another big round of applause for all of our folks who are if you haven't made your contribution for all the lunches and everything we did, please remember that. We want to make sure that they don't get holding the bag, so to speak, with having to pay everything that we want to pay for this. Tomorrow, we will be at a different location. So we will not have a Zoom connection tomorrow.
Unless we have.
Sadly, but no, apparently we don't. So this will be the end of our time. And how about anybody that can kind of get up here? Why don't you get up here and we'll see how many people we can get in the camera at once, because we've got a great audience.
Take all the ones that haven't been shown before.
Anybody that hasn't been up on the stage
Everybody
before,
go
come on
up.
up.
I stay here.
Anybody that hasn't been on the stage,
Come
on up.
Come on.
Come on, this is an opportunity to, yeah. There we go.
Hey, I have a suggestion. Everybody go in a row and present themselves.
Okay, that's what we'll do.
Start with Dragana up there, and then you say who you are.
Say who you are, where you're from.
Yeah, because we can't go up.
Okay.
Okay.
From Australia.
Cristina Ronchieri from Italy, observatory against the militarization of schools. I'm a teacher.
Yay.
Alessandra Mecozzi from Italy, Rome, the International Women's House.
Roma, Women International.
So next one, Nadia.
Use a possible
Peace Group Communist Party and also chairperson of the Communist Party.
And speak up.
Надія Ефимович, президент Союза уральских народов Украины, PhD студент, doctoral school, ST Europe, Budapest.
I'm Leila Launukari from Finland, Women for Peace.
I am Nazia Nouri from Afghanistan, Women International League for Peace and Freedom.
My name is Troy Nerland, Bike for Peace Norway. We have peace right all the whole world against nuclear weapon, peace in Myanmar, peace in Ukraine, and other places in the world.
My name is Ernest Gibson Kwadochi from Ghana. I represent the International Peace Bureau and the African Working Group of the IPB.
Hi, Pilar Castel, Rome, No War, theater actress. Wait, let's do it the other way around. Feminist, pacifist, theater activist. Ciao. Okay.
Yep, go.
Go?
Yes. Say
Okay. I'm Ada Donno from Italy. I'm president of the Association Women of Mediterranean Region.
She did a wonderful work on the declaration and the press.
Thank you.
My name is Marinella from Italy, Peace Link organization, and NATO must dissolve, rest in peace.
I come from Hungary and I work in the Hungarian and Eastern Central European social forums, Praxping 2, and I'm also an international peace activist.
Hello, everybody. I'm a member of Leuven Peace Movement, and I was born in Japan, but I've been living here for almost 40 years. And today, I could learn so much in this seminar, and I feel a lot of energy from all the people, but especially for young people, that motivate me a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emmeline from Vrede Visa 2. It's a Belgian peace organization.
And you coordinated our big action yesterday with our presentations. Thank you.
I am Paola Melchiori from the House of Women in Milano. And I think the idea of working on the cracks is a very good idea. We have to work more on.
Hello, I'm Ria from Belgium, and I work for the International Coalition to Ban Depleted Uranium Weapons.
Hello, I'm Sutken from Vrede Visa 2, who helped organize a bit this conference, the logistical part. Bye.
Sono Maurizio Nocera, un vecchio partigiano della pace. È stato un grande convegno, un grandissimo convegno. Avete messo un seme nella tana del lupo e la NATO scomparirà. Viva la pace!
And he's taken more pictures than anybody else here. He's our official photographer. And you. Okay. And we have over 20 women who are not here right now, who had to leave during the course of the day, but we had Cyprus, Morocco, UK, where else? All over. Yep.
Now we will try to share the video of the action of yesterday, but we need to search a little bit, so it can take 10 seconds. Okay.
And please share the photos too. We want to see the Italian man's photos.
everyone who put that together. Thank you. Yay. A big round of applause again for our movie makers.
And goodbye to our American friends in the United States.
Oh, yeah. And you're saying goodbye to us.
So we are closing the Zoom. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Next year in Washington.
Yes,
Okay.
here in Washington. See you in DC.
Let's prepare.
Yes,
Thank
you
you.
bet. You bet.
Thank
Bye.
you so
Very silly. Yeah.